So let's move on to the penultimate presentation of today, and that is by Tristan McIntosh. She is an assistant professor at the Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis in the USA, and she does research on ethical, social, and societal issues in medical research with special attention to workplace cultures. And today her contribution will be about the development and the assessment of an ethics education program. I really look forward to your presentation. Tristan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hopefully everyone can see my screen, but thank you for the warm welcome and good afternoon there. It's morning here. As was said earlier, I'm going to talk to you all today about developing and evaluating your ethics training programs. And that could be for programs that already exist or programs that you are planning to develop for the responsible conduct of research education. So just a quick overview of what I'm going to talk with you about today. I'm going to answer a few questions. The first one being why it's important to evaluate your ethics training program. And along with that, answering the question of what assessments you should use for evaluating your ethics training program. Now, quickly, I want to clarify those two terms, evaluation and assessment, because they're often used interchangeably, but they're a little bit different. So evaluation is a broader umbrella term that's really determining the degree to which the learning goals of your program are obtained, and assessments are more measured at the individual construct level, and those are the tools that you use to evaluate your training program. So I'll be talking today using both terms. I just wanted to provide that a little bit of clarification up front. But in addition to talking about what assessments you should be used, I'm going to talk to you about how you can use that assessment data to improve your training program and to make sure that your training program is having the intended effects that you would like it to, and also a couple of other best practices for evaluating your program. Also wanted to point out that I have a couple of moments throughout my talk today where I'm going to pause and have all of you write down a few things just sort of as an active learning exercise to make what I'm saying relevant for you and your ethics training program that you have either at your institution or that you're participating in. But I do ask that you just have a quick piece of paper pulled up to jot down a few notes. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. I'm not going to make you turn it in or anything. But diving into that first question, why should you evaluate your ethics training program? And I would say one of the biggest reasons why is that it helps you obtain evidence that your training is effective. So you don't want to spend all of this time and effort and money and other resources on developing a training that doesn't work well or it doesn't have the intended effects on trainees that you're looking for. So you want to make sure the goals of your program are being obtained and that your training results in those desired outcomes. So another way of thinking about this is that you don't want your trainees to walk away from training with the wrong message. So you don't want them to be overconfident or underconfident in their knowledge and skills related to navigating ethical issues. And so evaluating your program can sort of help you answer these questions here that I have on this slide. A second reason that you might want to evaluate your training program is that it can help you improve it. So I'd like to encourage everyone to understand that no training program is ever perfect or final in its development, especially when you're beginning a new training curriculum. So evaluating your program can help you identify areas that need a little bit of refinement, either in terms of the instructional content, activities, cases. So really don't assume that your program is perfect. And I really encourage everyone to adopt that continuous improvement mindset and goal as they're developing and refining their training program. And a third reason why someone might want to evaluate their training program is it can help you determine ongoing effectiveness after you make changes to the program. So going back to what I was saying about continuous improvement, when you make adjustments and add new activities or new RCR modules, you want to make sure that those changes that you make are continuing to make that training effective. So, this evaluation data could kind of clue you in like, oh, like this activity is working really well. Maybe it isn't working so well. So we need to go back to the drawing board and figure out something different to do. But really taken together, evaluation can provide information about how those changes that you're making to the training improve training effectiveness. And then a fourth reason why you might want to evaluate your training program well is that it helps you determine a minimum proficiency of your trainees. And another way to think of that is that you might want trainees to have a base level of knowledge about a certain topic, for example, different federal regulations as they relate to research. So you can test them on their general baseline understanding about those regulations to make sure, hey, yeah, everyone in this course understands what the basic rules of the road are, so to speak. So if you should remember anything from my talk today is this, it's that you should first identify the learning objectives of your training program before you plan any training content or evaluation. And this is because your training program learning objectives are directly linked to the type of content that you put in your training program and also directly linked to what type of assessments you are going to use to evaluate your training program. And I like to also point out that not all training programs are going to have the same learning objectives, nor should they. You kind of need to give some thought as to what it is that you want trainees to walk away from your training having learned in terms of knowledge, skills, attitudes, or behavior change. But regardless, all learning objectives should state the intended learning outcomes of the training program and specify exactly what it is that you want trainees to be able to do after training. On the screen here, I created some example learning objectives for the talk that I'm giving to you right now. So describe the learning goals of your training program, identify assessments for your training program, and understand how assessment data can be used to improve your training program. You can see here that all three of these learning objectives are stated using action verbs: describe, identify, understand. And it also pertains to different knowledge, skills, and activities that I'm hoping that you'll be able to take away from you after I'm done with this talk today. So in just a minute, I'm going to ask you to start perusing and brainstorming different learning objectives for your training program. But first, I'm going to go through various factors or things that you might want to assess and have be part of your learning objectives in your training program. So the first factor is knowledge, right? So researchers, they need to possess foundational knowledge about different rules and policies and regulations that are relevant for conducting research and doing so responsibly. And this knowledge also provides the basis for navigating ethical problems. So if you don't know the basic rules of the road for conducting research, you're not going to be able to navigate those ethical problems effectively. The knowledge is sort of the first run-of-the-mill, very standard thing to be able to measure as a result of your training program. Along with that is the development of skills. So scientists are often confronted with complex and ambiguous and uncertain problems. So developing skills to be able to navigate different ethical issues in science and just in generally, it can really help improve the quality of decisions that people make. So you can sort of think of skills, decision-making, problem solving, different strategies that people can leverage to navigate ethical issues. Those are all skills that can be developed in a training program. Then a fourth thing that you can assess is a person's attitude or perceptions about different things. So attitudes predispose people to think and behave in certain ways. And they also shape the way that people apply the knowledge and the skills that they have acquired in training to their actual work and research. So you want to make sure that people are having the right mindset of what you're teaching them and being able to apply that effectively. So some examples of different attitudes might be, understanding the importance of the responsible conduct of research or appreciating the importance of research integrity. And then the fourth thing that you could possibly assess is behavior, and that could be operationalized in terms of good work habits, the number of different corrective actions taken, if there are incidents of research misconduct findings. I will say that measuring behavior change is really tricky because there are a lot of other factors, and I'll talk about this a little bit later in my talk, but there are a lot of other factors that shape the way people take what they learn during training and apply it to their real world work. So something to keep in mind. I'd say by and large, a lot of the training programs that I'm familiar with focus on the knowledge and the skills element of a training program and work that into their learning objectives. So I'm going to give you guys maybe a minute or 30 seconds. I thought there would be other people on the line to chat, but in the Q&A session that we have after my talk today, we can talk through some of the learning objectives that you brainstorm. But go ahead and take a minute if you have that paper pulled up and write down maybe one or two specific learning objectives that you want your training program to have. Another way to think of this is specifying what you want trainees to be able to do or know after they take your ethics training program. So I have the knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behavior all listed here. So give some thought to that I gave you an example learning goal right here. So I gave you one for you so you can work from that. And that reads, improve ethical decision-making skills when faced with complex and uncertain situations in research. So I'll just pause and give you another maybe 10 seconds or so to brainstorm a learning objective or two, and then we can move on. All right, that's the bell. The time is up. So sort of transitioning to the specific types of assessments that you can use to evaluate your training program. I really like encouraging people to use a mixed methods approach to evaluation by using both quantitative and qualitative data, because each of those provide unique information that can help you as the person who's creating and evaluating your training program. It can help you really understand a robust picture of your training program's effectiveness. So first, I'm going to focus on quantitative assessments. Those are numerical assessments. Some strengths to this approach is that quantitative assessments are relatively quick to analyze. You can have your statistical software or Excel. It makes it really easy to analyze that numerical data in sort of a quick and easy way. A related strength is that it allows you to characterize your sample. So you can think of means, medians, standard deviations, frequencies. These are all really good snapshots of the effectiveness of your training program. And then the third sort of upside to quantitative assessments is that it allows you to compare groups easily. So you can compare training cohorts, you can compare across different sessions within a single training program, you can compare a pre-test assessment and a post-test scores on assessment. And these comparisons, if there are statistically significant differences between groups, that can signal to you that there might be potential issues in the training program to you. It can provide information to help you refine your program, or it can communicate to you, yeah, my training program is working. That's awesome. And you can use that information to sort of, advocate for your training program to demonstrate, yes, it's really of a high quality. So quantitative assessments, those, I just wanted to quickly clarify what that means. It can take the form of Likert scale or multiple choice survey questions, sometimes administered through Qualtrics or REDCap. You can do paper pencil if you want. You can administer them before and after training and even during training. So sometimes when I'm teaching RCR, I do in-class polls. I know that Zoom has that feature, and it's a really good way to just sort of take a quick snapshot of what your trainees are thinking throughout the actual training itself instead of just before and after. One thing to remember with quantitative assessments is that you should not just randomly make them up. It's really important to use a validated assessment. I know that there are several online for free, and I'll talk about a few options in a minute. But if you do end up wanting to develop your own quantitative assessment, I'd really encourage you to partner with someone who has measure development expertise, like a psychometrician. I know a lot of social scientists are trained in measure development. So I just wanted to point that out so that it's on your radar so that you can sort of get the most bang for your buck for whatever assessments you decide to use for evaluating your training program. Now moving on to qualitative assessments. These are more open-ended words that the trainees provide in response to prompts. So one upside to qualitative assessments is that it helps inform the development of survey questions. So if you wanted to develop a quantitative assessment, you can use this qualitative assessment to kind of generate possible areas for questioning. The second upside to qualitative assessments is that it can help you interpret quantitative data. So whereas quantitative data are numerical and sort of short, sweet, and to the point, qualitative data provide that rich information that can help you explain sort of the scores that you're seeing on your assessments. And to sort of round things out in this third point here, qualitative data really provide rich contextual information that you don't get with quantitative data. And it can help you identify, what is resonating with your trainees, and they can sort of explain their thought process and rationale, which makes sense, especially when, you're training on a topic like ethics that's really complicated and not easily, quantified down to a single number. So I think that, getting the rigor of the quantitative and the rich contextual information of the qualitative really is going to help you get a complete picture of how your ethics training program is performing. Some forms that qualitative assessments can take. I often do reflection exercises. So you'll see throughout my talk today, I have a couple of short, quick activities. And what that does is that it can engage trainees and sort of allow them to process their thinking. And sometimes I collect those when I'm teaching my students, and it helps me sort of see like what they're understanding, what they're not understanding, what's maybe confusing, or what I need to spend a little more time on. And that can be really helpful. Similarly, I like to sometimes do an activity where at the end of a training session, I ask trainees to write down 1 or 2 take-home points that they plan to use and apply in their daily life. And that's also really helpful to read through to see what message did I convey in my training today. You can also include open-ended questions on a survey. So if they provide a rating of something, you can ask them to provide a rationale. And also group discussion, so breakout groups in Zoom or whatever version of that you have on your end, that can also be a helpful way for collecting qualitative data. So all that together, you can sort of see benefits that qualitative and quantitative data provide. Now I'm going to transition just to give you a couple example assessments. I don't want to give you all of this information about the importance of evaluating your training program without directing you to a couple of example assessments that you can use. I want to be clear that this is not an exhaustive list that I'm about to go through, but really just to get you thinking and exploring about what assessment options are available out there. So the most common evaluation approach that I see taken in RCR programs is collecting reactions data. And that's pretty much measuring trainee perceptions of satisfaction with the training, what they liked, what they didn't like. It's really valuable to use this in obtaining reactions when trainees are focused on a training exercise activity. So you can tailor the reaction measures to course-specific features and instructional processes. So you can see if they really liked an activity or really didn't like an activity. You can use this data to improve your training improve your training like processes, content, activities, and use that feedback from trainees to make adjustments. However, there are some concerns with just using reaction data. So most people, when they're evaluating their training programs, they just stop here. And reaction data are helpful, but they don't tell you what trainees actually learned or what skills they developed as a result of training. So whatever you do, I definitely encourage you to use reaction measures, but also measure the knowledge or skills or whatever it is that you're wanting trainees to learn as a result of your training program. So you can see here on the slide, I gave a couple of examples. You can ask trainees to rate the effectiveness of a specific activity on a scale of 1 to 7 or whatever scale range you prefer. Or you can ask them about their overall motivation for the course. So to what extent are you motivated to apply training content to your own work? So you can sort of see, you can get a little bit, variety of perspectives from your trainees by looking at reactions data. I want to highlight a couple of different knowledge measures. There's one that I'm in the process of developing right now or have developed, and this is accessible through the Bioethics Research Center testing services. So that's where I work or where I'm professionally housed. And we have a test repository or an assessment repository of a bunch of different RCR measures. And this knowledge measure is available there, and it's free online. So you can go there if you're looking for a knowledge measure. It's a 34 multiple choice assessment that is mapped to 10 different responsible conduct of research topics. And there's only one form of it. And then the second one I wanted to highlight to you is by Holly Taylor. The Research Ethics, Knowledge, and Analytical Skills Assessment. That's a 41 item measure. That's a combination of multiple choice, true, false, and short answer. So you can see that the scoring with that one is a little more complicated than just a single multiple choice item. But the other part about that one is that it's parallel forms. And that's an interesting thing to keep in mind, is that with the single form, you might have testing effects. It depends on a lot of different things, but parallel forms pretty much means that you have 2 versions of a test that should, in theory, measure the same thing. So those are 2 example knowledge measures that I wanted to share with you. In terms of decision-making measures, so decision-making is a skill, right? And I think that that's a common learning objective for different responsible conduct of research courses. So both Jim Dubois and Mike Mumford developed these measures of ethical and professional decision-making. I've worked very closely with both of them, and I know these measures very well. They both have their strengths and upsides. The one that I currently use in my work is the professional decision-making measure. It's a little bit shorter than the ethical decision-making measure is, and it's more generalizable to, I guess, different areas of different professions, I guess you could say, or different fields or areas of expertise. The ethical decision-making measure, the EDM, There are multiple different forms of it that are field specific, whereas the PDR is not field specific, it's just field general. Both of them have parallel forms. The PDR assesses professional decision-making strategy use, whereas the ethical decision-making measure reflects ethicality in the use of sense-making strategies. So they both really measure very similar constructs. It just sort of depends on what assessment you prefer to use. Now I want to highlight a couple of example attitudes and values measures. So the HIT-RES was developed by Jim Dubois, and then the values and scientific work was developed by Tammy English in tandem with Jim Dubois, actually. So the HIT-RES is a 54-item measure that assesses self-serving cognitive distortions. So you can sort of think about things like, like thinking errors, like assuming the worst of people, blaming others, minimizing things, self-centered thinking. It assesses those sorts of constructs. And then the second one, the values and scientific work, that's a 35-item measure that assesses intrinsic, extrinsic, and social values in scientific work. So those are just a couple of examples of different attitudes and perceptions-based assessments that you can use to evaluate your program. So I also wanted to point out there are short-term versus long-term changes. So certain outcomes can take longer to come to fruition than others. So for example, changing someone's attitude is likely going to take a lot longer and be a lot more complicated to change compared to changing someone's knowledge about a topic. So I just wanted to say, don't lose hope if you don't see the effects that you're looking for right away, especially if you're getting into that attitude and behavior change area of measurement. But to support that kind of long-term behavior and attitude change, I wanted to talk about a few considerations at the research team and institutional level that can help support the training program. So I guess one way of thinking about this is that, the post-training environment is just as important as the training itself. There are factors external to a training program that play a role in shaping trainees' knowledge, attitude, skills, and behavior. And that includes the post-training environment. So the lab where they work, the institution where they work, the people who they work with. So it's important that the environment that they're in supports training transfer, so they can take what they learned during training and apply it to their real life. And that's sort of a fancy way of saying that trainees should have the opportunity to apply what they learned during training and get supported in doing so. And so that means that they should be encouraged and rewarded by others to apply whatever it is that they learn. So that can include faculty, leaders of research teams, leaders of institutions. Different institutional policies and norms should definitely align with training content. So you don't want to teach something in training and then have a lab rule or an institutional rule that conflicts with that or goes against that. So you want to make sure all of those organizational processes are aligned with whatever is being taught in training. I won't give you the full 2 minutes here, but on that sheet of paper, I want to have you pause and take a second to think about what an environment looks like that supports and reinforces ethics training. You can think about this at various levels, right? On the individual level, on a team-based level, on an institutional level. So sort of think about a training that you've taken, for example, and then you left and you went to go do your work, and what was helpful in making sure that you could apply that training to what you were doing in your work. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to think through what that might look like. And then on the next slide, I have a few ideas of my own, but I'm hoping during our Q&A session today, we can dive deep into this because I think it's an often undervalued and underobserved part of ethics training that is so critical. Because again, you don't want to put all this time and effort into developing a training program that's not going to have that lasting impact on your trainees. And so investing in that training transfer and the environment to support your training program is equally as important. All right, that'll be the bell to move forward. So up here, I have a couple of different, suggestions for ways to reinforce training content in the lab or in an institutional environment. The first is setting an appropriate tone about the responsible conduct of research. And with that, I would say, PIs or people who lead research teams, I would really encourage avoid using cynical language when discussing matters of compliance, right? Sometimes, it can be cumbersome and acknowledge that, but also encourage your trainees to think it's really important to doing responsible research as part of being compliant. The second mechanism for reinforcing training content is providing constructive rationale about why certain policies, procedures, and norms are in place. And what that can do is sort of illustrate how those policies support the responsible conduct of research. And then a third thing is making RCR relevant and articulating that doing responsible and rigorous research not only makes science better, but also contributes to a person's career success. And that really helps incentivize people to be able to, apply what they learned during training to their jobs. And then finally, having people explicitly encourage applying their training in their day-to-day work, especially when they're faced with complex and uncertain and emotion-laden situations. Lab leaders really also need to be open to change and improving their own practices as well. So if their trainees come to them and say, hey, I learned this thing in ethics training, we might want to reconsider doing it this different way in our lab. It's, a good thing for that person who's leading the team to go ahead and consider ways to make revisions to their policies that are in alignment with what was taught in the ethics training program. So taking all of this together, reinforcing training content in a day-to-day work environment helps support the lasting impact of ethics training. And doing this will help ensure that the resources that you put into your training program don't go to waste and are sort of maximized in their effectiveness. So to wrap things up with my talk, I want to talk about a few other best practices for evaluating your ethics training program. The first is identifying clear learning objectives. I know that I said this at the beginning of my talk, but it's so critical to have that tied into the training content and the assessments that you choose to evaluate your training program. Again, sort of aligning those learning goals with appropriate assessments. So I went through a couple of different assessment options. You can also develop your own if you partner with someone who is good at, measurement development. Another thing to consider is delivering assessments at the appropriate time and also not over assessing, right? You can't assess everything. So be strategic in terms of what assessments you pick and think about how long it takes trainees to complete those assessments and think through when you want to, have trainees complete the assessments essentially. And I guess another final word of wisdom is use validated assessments and not to just make them up haphazardly. I know that not all institutions have the same resources needed to be able to do this. Just to make up an assessment, they might not have someone with the expertise. So I would say go and look online. I know that the Bioethics Research Center has that test bank, but I know that the Online Ethics Center, I think, has some assessments available. And I know that there are several folks who are in the works of making other assessments. So be on the lookout for those. I guess, for other best practices, just to wrap things up, plan for and be systematic about your evaluation. So it really does pay off to think strategically about it and not just rush into it. And, don't evaluate just to check the box to say that you evaluated, but do it really to learn about and improve your ethics training program. And I guess one other thing is to make evaluation a regular occurrence. So ideally, you would look at a pattern across multiple data points using that qualitative and quantitative data, to complement one another. There's always going to be a little bit of error in measurement, right? So triangulating these different data points can help paint a more robust picture of how effective your training program is. And again, you won't be able to assess everything. Think about the time that it takes for your trainees to complete their assessments. And that will, definitely help make it a robust training program. And then one other consideration is thinking through whether performance on an assessment is affected by culture or English fluency. So for example, people who speak English as a second language may score lower on certain assessments because of the type of words or jargon that's used, and that adds unwanted error in measurement. It's not that they're not, performing lower, they're just, that language or English fluency, I guess, can help, or not can help, it can, make it a little bit more difficult to get that accuracy in measurement. So really all this to say is think about the readability and the ease of use and understanding of the measures. You can check their Lexile level and whether or not those questions in the assessment can be easily understood. So those are all of the things that I have to say to you. So I'll pause here and open the floor for questions if people want to talk about the learning objectives they brainstormed or those post-training environment factors, I definitely be open to talking about those or anything else that.
Well, thank you very much, Tristan, for this interesting exposition of what you need to evaluate research integrity education. I like your tour d'horizon showing that you have qualitative methods, quantitative methods, and I especially like your plea to use really structured instruments that have been validated to some extent at least. While the people are typing in their Q&A box the answers to your two assignments, namely what are your favorite learning goals and what is your favorite optimal environment, I have the opportunity to open the discussion, if I may. Evaluation can mean many different things. Evaluation of education as well. And you set out that it can be qualitative and quantitative. And when you do it quantitative, you can look at satisfaction and process measures, of course. And then you can move down or up, whatever you like, to intermediate endpoints like knowledge, like skills, like attitude. And you plead specifically for that, for these intermediate endpoints. And then, of course, you have the endpoints that really matter. That is less questionable research practices, more responsible research practices. And you correctly, I believe, explained that on the road to these real outcomes, many other interventions pop up. So it's not ideal to evaluate it in that sense only. You need to look at process and intermediate outcomes as well. I'm from the biomedical field myself, and there you have that when you study drugs or medical treatments, sometimes you have a good reason to go for intermediate outcomes. And when you go for intermediate outcomes, you need to be able to explain how well these intermediate outcomes are connected to the real outcomes. So, and that is a long introduction, too long for my question. And my question is, can you tell a little bit more about the evidence, the available evidence that your favorite intermediate outcomes are really closely connected to responsible research practices and questionable research practices in opposite ways, of course?
Yeah, and just to quickly clarify, when you say intermediate outcomes, you're talking about like knowledge, skills, attitudes, things like that.
Yes.
And to what extent those are actually that they provide a good evidence base for training effectiveness?
Yeah, predictors of the real thing, namely the behavior we want to see on the ground.
Got it. Yep, I know exactly what you're asking, and it's a really complicated question to answer just because, as I said in my talk, like the environment after the training also shapes the way that that training is applied. I think that, immediately following training, oftentimes you see an uptick in ethical behavior, an uptick in reports of, questionable behavior because people are more sensitized to it and in tune with it. But then after that dies down a little bit, that's when it gets a little bit grayer and it's just like, well, the environment's also shaping this. And, are the people who are the trainees, are the people that they're being mentored by, are those mentors reinforcing those points? And so there's a lot of different touch points along the way that can help reinforce or not reinforce what was learned in training. But I think that these intermediary level variables are good proxies for that. Like, you kind of have to weigh the options. Like it's difficult to, assess, a year from now, what the different behaviors are and how those specific behaviors have changed over time. So I'd say those proximal or intermediary assessments are good for determining, especially for knowledge and skills. I'd say that those two are probably more robust and reliable measures for assessing training program effectiveness, whereas those attitude and behavioral change are more sort of those long-term factors, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. And the question is difficult, and I pose a question I honestly don't know the answer myself about, so I'm really interested in your view on this. The point is, of course, that when you do that, when you go for what I call the intermediate endpoints, you need to have some evidence base that they are really predictive of behavior on the ground later on. And I know this is difficult to establish, and it will be a very complicated research, of course, to make it happen. But is there any empirical evidence, as far as you know, that links the two, the real behavioral stuff and the stuff you advocate correctly, I believe, that we should measure in our courses?
Yeah, I can't think offhand like a particular study that has looked at it. I might have to ask around with some of my colleagues and see if they know of like a specific study that has been done that links those two. I'm not sure that there's one that's been done officially. I think that there have been studies that show like that the knowledge and skills are foundational to those those behaviors, but I can't recall of any specific study that demonstrates the relationship between sort of these more intermediate variables and longer term. And I think that's an area where RCR education should go into and examine those relationships a little bit more explicitly.
Yeah,
So,
and it will be difficult, of course. I fully agree, but I believe it's important. Like it is in clinical medicine, when you study effect on blood pressure, you want to know what it means for heart failure, heart attacks, and cardiovascular death, of course. And once you've established that beyond doubt, you can go back to blood pressure, but that's so easy to measure. And this is a bit similar, maybe.
yeah, that's a great analogy. Okay.
There is a question from Fenneke Blom. She, as I do, likes your approach a lot and your plea to evaluate, because that is how I could summarize your talk, I believe. But where are the roadblocks? What is coming on your way when you try to evaluate? Why do you think that it doesn't always happen? It sounds so logical, so there must be something holding people back.
Yeah, so just to make sure I'm understanding the question, you're asking what are the barriers to evaluating your program?
Exactly.
Right? That's the
Exactly.
question. And honestly, I mean, I'm an organizational psychologist by training, so I've been professionally trained to think like that, but sort of stepping outside of that realm, I think a lot of people maybe don't evaluate because they don't know what assessments are out there to be used. So I think part of it is just learning what you can assess and sort of going what I was saying about tying your learning objectives and your training content and your assessment, having that all streamlined. I think that gets lost so often that people just create this training program and then pick an assessment that they think might be relevant. And so you have that disconnect between those three elements, your objectives, your content, and your assessments. And when they're not in alignment, that's a huge roadblock, right? Like you're not going to get the information that you need. I also think that another barrier or roadblock is some institutions or training programs are under-resourced or understaffed, so they might not have the capacity to pause and think through and plan through all of this. And so hopefully, this talk or something similar can help at least provide that foundational knowledge of like, here's what you can do, here are some options and that are free and accessible and relatively not time consuming that can be implemented to improve training programs.
Yeah, well, thank you. Mariette van der Hoven, one of the speakers earlier today, but it was in the middle of the night for you, I fear. She says, I really appreciate your overview of what you can measure and what good tools are already available. That's wonderful. And then she said, while focusing on these tools which are there and on the shelf and ready to use, don't we use a risk, and that's a bit similar to the point I was raising before, that we lose sight of the stuff that really matters and that we stop thinking that we have a successful educational program for research integrity when we score on knowledge and attitude scales, for instance, and have not even explored what will happen to the real thing, the behavior on the ground.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right in bringing that point, is that those knowledge and skills measures, they're very short term, right? They just capture a single moment and it doesn't capture the long-term behavior change. And I think it's important, when you're assessing your program and, you get good data and it shows that your training program is effective, like that's great, but it's also, that's why I was sort of saying in one of my points, like adopting that continuous improvement mindset is so critical. Like you're never done and perfect with your training program. Like I know I teach an RCR course each year for some students, and I make changes every single year. Just, you learn new information, new regulations might pop up. You might hear of a different case, or you attend a conference like this that you're like, oh, I should be thinking about this differently. So I think that mindset can help avoid that complacency in thinking. If you get, good assessment data. Going back to a point that we talked about earlier, like I think longer term behavior change is difficult to measure because it's really complicated and there are a lot of factors that shape it. But I think in turn to support that behavior change, maybe, assessing labs like lab culture or organizational climate, things that are in the environment that can, support or hinder the transfer of that training. So I think that those types of measures could be used. They wouldn't be measured at like the individual trainee level, but maybe at a broader team-based or institutional level, and that can signal maybe some of those environmental factors that could weigh in on training.
Yeah, well, I fully agree. Thank you so much. Well, the answers to the homework are not exactly flowing in, so I'm giving you my own answers, and I would like you to respond to that. When you ask what is your favorite learning goal, I immediately thought that is helping students on what level they are to navigate the dilemmas they will encounter in practice. And if that is a goal, a learning goal, you consider worthwhile doing it, how should I evaluate it?
Yes, I think that is a very good learning goal. Getting trainees to a point where they can effectively navigate ethical issues. Like that's one of the main reasons why we're doing this, right? I think that skill development is really part and parcel with that. So, in my line of work, we teach something called the SMART strategies, and they're ethical and professional decision-making strategies. So it's like seek help managing emotions, anticipating consequences, recognizing circumstances, and testing assumptions. So it's an acronym for SMART. And the professional decision-making measure we use assesses those 5 different strategies and their application. So it's a vignette-based measure where people are given a scenario. So it's like a proxy for a real-life scenario, but in a little paragraph, and they can choose among different options of how they would respond. And that's a good analog for a real-life situation when they're faced with complexity and uncertainty. So I would do something like that if I were assessing a program focused on helping trainees develop the skills needed to navigate ethical situations.
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting answer. And my favorite for the optimal environment is away from campus, where people are not rushing into the departments back again, answering their emails, preferably in a site when they cannot use their phones or their computers, in isolation, in short. Is that your favorite as well, or do you have arguments against it?
Could you explain or elaborate on that a little bit more? I'm curious, when you say when they're by themselves, are you thinking like when they're just sitting there reflecting on what they're doing, or if they're just by themselves at home doing their work?
No, I mean, when you organize a course on research integrity, I'd like to have people in a classroom or on a Zoom screen, like we are now used to today to it. But let's say in a classroom, and when that classroom is within a university hospital, for instance, there will be many interferences. People will arrive late, leave early, have appointments during lunch, answering emails and messages on the phones in between. I love to teach them while they have nothing else to do. And for that reason, we go to a cheap place on the coast and there convene together for 1 or 2 days and talk about different things. Because the advantage is that you have attention and you have this connection to the regular workflow. The disadvantage is that there is this theory that you can apply new tricks and new knowledge in the environment where you learned it. And that speaks against it, of course.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't heard of people going off-site into some place before where they're totally disconnected, but I do see the advantages to that, right? Because you don't want trainees that are distracted or they're not paying attention. I do think that regardless of whatever ethics training mode you use, having synchronous training is important so that trainees can learn from one another and talk to one another and sort of engage actively in that material. And maybe that's along the lines of what you were saying, like going off-site where people can just sit and be in this new environment with new people and exchange ideas. I think that that's so critical. You know, it's a really essential part of ethics training is sort of working with other people. Like that's how, you know, that's what happens when you're faced with an ethical dilemma. For example, you're working with other people, navigating problems and learning good communication. So I think that having intentional instruction, such as you described, is what's important.
Okay, well, timekeeping is one of my ugly responsibilities today, so we have to end here. I'd like to thank you again very, very much. It has been an enlightening lecture. Thank you for being here.